Welcome to the Revitalize My Church podcast, created to help churches navigate change and reorient to a new and healthy future. Here's the host of the show, Bart Blair.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Revitalize My Church podcast. My name is Bart Blair. I am the Director of Church Revitalization for a ministry called Assist Church Expansion. And we started this podcast in 2024 with the goal of helping churches navigate change and find their way to a new and healthy future. If you happen to be a church leader, a minister, an elder, a member, or just a curious onlooker wanting to learn more things about church revitalization and church replanting, you've come to the right place. We are not necessarily experts in the area, but we have been practitioners for about 6 or 7 years now as we've walked alongside many churches in our small fellowship of churches that have been going through seasons of revitalization and renewal. And even better, we are bringing guests onto this podcast who come from different tribes and different parts of the church world who have lots of different experiences and insights than we do. And we just pick their brains and learn from them. Now, we release 2 episodes every month, one on the 1st of the month and one on the 15th of the month. And typically on the 1st of the month, you're hearing a discussion between Nathan Bryant, the executive director of our ministry, and myself. But I've got a little bit of a different twist on today. It's another one of my Assist Church Expansion colleagues. His name is Ed Short, and Ed has been working with our team for just a few years now, but he has been working with churches inside our fellowship and outside of our fellowship for many years. Ed is an experienced pastor and church leader, church planter. He's been an executive pastor, a senior pastor. He has been a coach both in churches and ministries all throughout the country for a long time. I'm not trying to say that Ed is old, but well, Ed, if you're listening to this, sorry, bud, you're old, at least older than I am. But with that age brings all kinds of wisdom. And Ed is a great guy to have on our team. I've learned a ton from him, and I really enjoy working with him. The conversation that we had recently was specifically related to the pastoral search process and pastoral transition. Ed has worked with many churches in helping them put together their search team, their search process, interviewing candidates, and making a decision on which candidate the Lord is leading the church to call to be their new pastor. And so Ed and I talked through some of the better practices that he's learned over the years as he has worked with churches in this space, how to set your team up and prepare your team for the interview process, how to discern the right candidate, how to have that difficult conversation about money and finances, as well as other tidbits that I think that you will hopefully find as helpful as I did. So anyway, appreciate you tuning into this episode. Make sure that you subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed wherever you listen. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, give us a thumbs up and leave a comment. That'll feed the algorithm of the interwebs and more people will find this podcast. And again, share it with a friend if you know someone who you think might be able to benefit from this content. Well, thanks again for tuning in. Here's my recent conversation on pastoral search and pastoral transition with Ed Short. Ed Short, welcome to my podcast. I'm so glad to be able to hang out with you this afternoon.
Privileged to hang out with you, Bart, really.
Ed, as I introduced you in the introduction of this podcast as a ministry colleague, that's what we are. That's what we have been. I'd also consider you a friend and someone that I look up to in ministry. You've been around the block a little bit.
A couple of laps, actually.
A couple of laps around the block. Why don't you start by sharing with our audience a bit of your ministry background and how you ended up doing what you're doing today?
Sure. Okay. I am super passionate about the local church and seeing it be effective. Been a lead pastor for about 25 years. Been an executive pastor before that and a youth pastor before that. If you cut me, you will find that I really value reaching lost people, growing Christ followers, because not only are they learning the word, they're living the word, and then equipping people to do the work of the ministry. I really think that the ministry of a church, 90% of it ought to happen outside of the building, 10% in the building. And I work with a lot of pastors, do a lot of coaching, do a lot of consulting, help churches find their next pastor. And so I've been doing that for the last 20 years.
Yes, which is a big part of the reason I wanted to have you on the show today. You and I, we partnered together in a lot of our ministries, partnerships with churches that are going through a season of revitalization or refreshing or even replanting. And one of the things that we've been tasked to do with a number of churches over the course of the last number of years is help them find new pastors. And when you joined our team, that was one of the highlights for me because I knew that you'd had years and years of experience of coaching churches through a search process, finding candidates, vetting candidates, and even preparing those candidates for what they were in for when they started in a new church. Let's talk a little bit about some of that experience. I've got some bullet points that I shared with you earlier, and I know that we might stick to a few of those, but let's start with this question. When a church is losing or has lost a long-tenured pastor, let's say somebody for 15 years or longer, what are some of the unique challenges that the church faces in their search process that another church that burns through pastors more quickly might not face?
Well, I think that one of the keys there is they probably don't realize how much of the flavor of the church is really their former or retiring pastor.
Okay.
He's had a major influence on them. For some of the people probably on the search team or the screening team, they've never had any other pastor. And so their grid's a little bit narrow. So I think just to understand that, I would call timeout if I were in a situation like that and say, hey, what we have to do is we got to assess where we are as a ministry. Because I think churches, like if you've had a pastor for 30 plus years, you haven't hired a new lead pastor for 30 plus years. And you have this idea that you just go to Walmart, go down aisle 37 on the left-hand side, halfway down, there's the stock of pastors, you just pick one. And probably if you really like your current pastor, he looks a lot like him. If you don't, he's on the opposite side of the store. He's way over here. So I think you call timeout and you do an assessment that says, hey, how effective are we? What are we doing really well? What are we not doing well? Every church that I work with pretty much wants to skip that portion and get right to, let's go find the guy. So I think it starts with assessment. Then you got to take the time with the leadership team and begin to dream about where you want to go. So now you understand where you are, the good, the bad, the ugly, and where we want to go. And we ought to go out and find a pastor that can help us get from point A to point B. If you don't do that, what happens is he comes in and he thinks you're here and he wants to go here. You want to go east. He wants to go west. Your pastor is going to last 2 years. Now, if you do the homework, if you assess, if you set the vision, you put that then in the posting so you understand the flavor that you're looking for, more than likely you can find somebody that's going to be a fit.
There's a saying, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is the guy after the guy is never the guy, right? When you've had that guy for 30 plus years who you love, who maybe was even your church planter, right?
Yes.
And you go to replace that person, oftentimes it feels like a match made in heaven for about 5 minutes, and then it can go south very quickly. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the guy after the guy so often has a difficult time being the next guy?
I think it goes back to the vision piece. I don't think the leadership team has determined we are going north, and they sell north to the congregation before we find the guy that's going to help us go north. Because if there's adjustments that are going to be made in the vision, it's going to appear they're being made because of the new guy, where it ought to be the elder team, the overseer team, the deacon team, whatever your leadership structure is. It ought to be those individuals that are determining the direction. And oh, by the way, we found a guy who wants to go in the same direction that we want to go in.
Now, one of the things that happens often, Ed, when you and I are working with churches that have lost or are losing a long-time tenured pastor is that there really isn't anyone in the church that has the visionizing and leadership capacity to even envision anything new or different from where the church is. You've had one pastor who's been there, who sort of set the course. The church has gone that course. And the idea or the prospect of going in any different direction is anathema. Like, why wouldn't the next guy just want to come and pick up the baton and go exactly down the same lane, running on the same track that our previous pastor was? What do you do in a situation when the church simply doesn't have the leaders in place. They don't have qualified elders. They don't have those visionary people, but they know, like, maybe the church has been in decline or they've been stagnant for some time. How do they go about finding this guy who can help them steer the
Well,
direction?
that's a great question, Bart. I think the answer is you got to bring in an outside person who doesn't have any bias one way or the other, who's going to ask a lot of hard questions. And before you bring that guy in, by the way, you better make sure that you're on the same page with him. At least you want to go north. He wants to go north. Now it's safe. Now you bring in somebody who's going to ask a lot of hard questions, go back to that assessment piece, and you're going to all of a sudden discover we're still going to go north, but the way we went north was Route 72. We're going to take I-95, and we're going to bring in a guy who's going to have new ideas. If a guy's been your pastor for 37 years, for instance, he probably has some ideas that are 37 years old, and he's still doing this, which maybe worked back then, but might not work very well today. So an outside source coming in could really greatly help you.
So tell me a little bit about what a search process would look like for a church that's going through a transition or has gone through a transition. They've got a pastoral vacancy. Maybe it's been 30 years since they've, found a new pastor. If the last time they searched for a pastor was, we're recording this in 2025, it was 1995. A lot of things have changed. What does a search committee, what does a search team need to think through? What do they need to do? What's the process they need to follow in order to go and find a new pastor?
Yeah. Well, I think they need to, after they've taken the time to assess, and they wouldn't be the screening team, but the leadership team, after they've taken the time to assess, after they've taken the time to dream of the future, now they've got to say, okay, what kind of guy do we need to go from here to there? That's what I would call the posting. You and I have put out hundreds of postings, and most postings are very generic, and that's a mistake. I want that posting to be so clear that when somebody reads it, they go, that's not me.
You mean it has to say more than he has an MDiv and he meets the qualifications of eldership?
Right. Yeah. He's an expository preacher. He's this preacher. He loves Jesus. He's been this, that, and the other thing. Like that's not it. Like if a church really has been good but not great, then I'm looking for a pastor that is a next step guy. He can help us take that. So he has to be somewhat of a risk taker. He has to be driven to a point. Now, if you bring in a guy that's hyper driven when a guy before him was a typical shepherd who went incredibly slow, that guy's going to last 2 years because the people aren't ready for the pace. He thinks he's going 30 miles an hour. The people think he's going 80 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm. When you have a situation like that, what can a search team and or a leadership team do to prevent putting unrealistic expectations on their new pastor when their new pastor comes in?
Well, I think one of the things would be it is not bad to be without a full-time pastor. An interim guy could really help a lot because it allows everybody to come up for air. The new guy's his preaching style is not going to be compared so much to the former pastor that's been there 35 years, his preaching style. So to wrestle that piece through, and then it goes back to who's really going to lead the church. So if you're in a church of 57 people, it's a lot different than being in a church of 300, 400, 500, 600, right? Mm-hmm. The larger church probably has some capable leaders who really could, and they have credibility with the congregation. They're the ones that share the big picture components of the new vision. So that when the guy comes, people go, wow, he does seem to be the guy. And he wants to go north. We want to go north. Let's see if it's a match. The other thing that goes along with that, it's not just, we got a match of a guy that his theology is our theology and his philosophy of ministry is our philosophy of ministry. But you got to find a guy that's a fit. And I talk to churches a lot about picture yourself in a small boat on a lake fishing with one person all day. If you don't fit, that's going to be a dreadful day. And you're hiring someone that you better like to be in a small boat with them fishing all day. There's a fit. I mean, when you're with them, it's enjoyable. right? So if your grid is this and the new guy's grid is this, even though he might be amazing at doing that, that's probably going to become annoying at some point.
Well, let me ask you a question then. What do we do in the actual search process, the interview process, the candidating process that gives us the best chance to see if this is a good chemistry fit? I mean, that's the word that you're looking for there, right? It's relational, it's chemistry, it's cultural. What are some of the things that we can do to make sure that we've got a right match?
So after you have put the posting out, a lot of somebodies have responded, and some of them are pretty easy to go, no, this might be an interesting person. This might be an interesting person. So after you have walked through some of that process, maybe they filled out a questionnaire or two, maybe you've Zoomed with them, you think you know them at that point, you don't. So what I would do after I narrowed that process down, maybe 50 people threw their name in the hat and 20 were very easy to go, no. 30 might have gotten some kind of questionnaire and 15 made the cut to get the next questionnaire and 7 made the cut to Zoom with them. Now we've narrowed the 7 down. We got a top 3 and we go, let's pick the top 1. We're not going to candidate him yet, but let's bring him and his wife in to hang out with us for 3-4 days. And it's an expense, but you're saving yourself a lot of hassle. So come in, and it's not a 3 or 4 day interview. It's come in, let's just do life together. Let's hang out. Let's go bowling. I don't know why anybody would want to go bowling, but let's go. The advantage of bowling, though, if you really think about it, is it's pretty boring. So what do? You talk the whole time. If you're not throwing a ball, you're talking. So it's that talking. It's like, did I leave the conversation filled up? Did I leave the conversation drained? Was I neutral? Will he relate not only to the people we have, but the people we want to reach? Like, I'm pretty passionate. I know you're pretty passionate about reaching unchurched people. Like, if he doesn't relate to unchurched people, he might be a great preacher. At least in my church, he can't be the guy because he doesn't. You cut him and he's not going to bleed the blood of evangelism. So when I'm with him, I can begin to sense that, and I think the team can begin to sense that. That time is far more important than any kind of Q&A thing that you're going to have with him.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we experience often is a sense of urgency with churches. Oftentimes when a pastor is leaving or has left, or in some cases has passed away, there's an urgency to backfill that position. Now, you've addressed that already in one way by finding an interim pastor. Let's be honest, you and I both know this. It's really difficult to find interim pastors. There are ways of doing it, and there are creative ways of going to fill the pulpit for a season. It's not the end of the world if you don't have, the same level of preaching in that interim season that maybe your previous pastor had. But I think if I call out a mistake, I'll call out 2 mistakes, and then you can address them. One you already sort of have. One is a rush, being in too big of a hurry, feeling like we need to have someone yesterday. And so we don't slow down enough to take the time to date, to court, to get to know each other, so that we see if this really is a good match. The other side of that is we're not willing to spend money to make the process all that it needs to be. We're not willing to spend money on assessments. We're not willing to spend money to fly the candidate and his spouse to the city where we're doing ministry. I actually talked to a pastor just a few weeks ago who a church was offering to bring him out. He found out at the last minute that they weren't bringing his wife, which was like a huge red flag to me, a huge red flag, right? So a pastoral search process is going to cost you something. You can go to an agency and you can pay an agency that's an expert in this, and that will cost you a lot more. Right. But at the very least, you've got to expect a pastoral search process to cost you something. Why don't you talk a little bit about those things?
Well, there is going to be a cost one way or the other. So if you're cheap on the front end, they go, you know what, we're not going to bring the guy in until we're ready to candidate him, or we're going to bring him in, but not his wife, and we're going to save $500 of a flight. You find out later that was a mistake. So it is going to cost you, and it's going to cost you a lot more because you're going to be doing a new process 2-3 years from now. So to bring the person in, invest in them, You talked about resources that are out there. The Working Genius profile, great profile, helps you to understand, like, if when you do that, half of the responsibilities the guy's going to have are not in his wheelhouse, he's not the guy.
Mm-hmm.
When you look for somebody, if you're looking for somebody that needs to be more low key and he is a massive high D, he's not the guy. Those profiles, they cost you a few bucks, but they're going to save you in the long run.
Yeah, let me just pause you there. We typically, when we're screening candidates for prospective churches that we're working with, we have them do the Working Genius, which is it's a business assessment. So we'll call it what it is, but it is really, really good. It really gives you, let's face it, being a pastor is a job, and it has job responsibilities. And what that Working Genius assessment does is it gives you an indication of what that person is going to be enthusiastic about and what is going to make them basically want to quit the job over, right? And so you have to look at that. The second thing we do a disc profile, a disc analysis, which is a personality test. We also do a spiritual gifts assessment. I think it's really important to do a spiritual gifts assessment because not all pastors are gifted in the same way. And especially if you are comparing your new pastor to your previous pastor, and there are certain things that made that previous pastor gold in your church community, having a new pastor who has similar spiritual gifts might be necessary. Even if his personality and his ministry style is different, having similar spiritual gifts might be important. Sorry, jumped in there on you.
100%. I'm totally with you, 100%. It makes sense. You got to know what you're buying, and that's super important.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of what you're buying, let me shift the conversation to this. Okay. This is another conversation that you and I often have, and it's a very sensitive one. And so, with all due respect, Ed and I joke around a lot, and sometimes we get funny, and we try to say funny things. We laugh with each other. A lot of
we actually think we are funny.
We think we are, and a lot of times, people, while we're laughing with each other, everyone else is looking at us like we have three heads. But here's the thing. One of the struggles that we often have with churches is helping the church prepare an offer for the pastor that they finally decided is the right guy. What do we pay him? What kind of benefits? What does this look like? It's going to obviously be very different in every church's context and every church's setting. What are some of the baseline things or some of the bullet points that you walk a church through when you're trying to help them figure out what they need to offer the next pastor, other than simply saying, we're going to offer him exactly what we were offering the previous pastor, because that's not always appropriate. Talk through that.
Sure. Well, I think it depends if you're a church of 50, you're going to look at this different than you're a church of 1,000, right? There's a range there, right? And you have to, churches tend to be cheap. We used that word earlier. That they're thinking, okay.
I don't think we were recording when we used that word, but now everybody knows we were talking about cheap churches.
Okay. So, we try to lowball, and I'm going, if this guy's a second round draft choice, you can't pay him the same amount you pay a sixth round draft choice. I don't think anybody ought to be in ministry to make money. I don't buy that. It's a passion. I want to hire a guy that would do it for free if he could. That's what I'm after. But if a guy is a 300 hitter and has defensive skills and can catch a ball and can run, he's worth more than a guy that can hit 210. And I know that, like it or not, there's a bit of a competition. Now, I think sometimes I don't know what it's been like for you, Bart. I've been in 7 churches in my 40-year career. And sometimes God tapped me on the shoulder, and it's like, you're going there no matter what. And I've signed on to go before I even talked about what the finances were going to be, because God was in that thing. But sometimes it's like I could go here or here or here. And I just have to think about, like, what's going to be the best fit. I have never gone someplace because I made more money there, right? But when you think about it, like, what is this guy really worth? What do we need to do to take care of him and his family? What kind of a situation is he coming from? Like, if he's making $120,000 in Ohio and he's moving to California, that's not $120,000 over there, right? But if he's making $120,000 in California and he's moving to Pennsylvania, well, I probably don't need to pay him $120,000. He might think I do, but you have to understand where he's coming from and what how effective he is. I think we tend to look at guys and go, well, he has a bachelor's, he has a master's, and he has a doctorate. Honestly, I don't care about any of those things. I want to know, what can the guy do? And the way you look at that is you go back and you look at what he's been doing. And it's real easy to come up with all kinds of excuses why it didn't work here or there or everywhere else. But really, you look at somebody's track record, and that's pretty much what you're going to get the next time. So if he has a good track record, I have to be willing to be, quote unquote, competitive in how I'm going to look at that.
Let me share with you some of my thoughts on this. For starters, I'd be the guy that you'd want to hire because I've been in 3 churches, and 2 of them I said yes with 0 salary. I'll figure it out. And one of them I said yes, and it was barely above 0. So, and I think part of the reason that the perspective I'm about to share I have is because of the ministry experience that I've had. When I'm looking at bringing in a guy, if I really believe he's the guy who God has appointed for this ministry opportunity, I never want finances to be a reason for him to not be fully focused on the ministry that we're calling him to do. I have heard elder boards say, well, this is a livable wage. Mm-hmm. Being a livable wage isn't necessarily making life easy or less complex for the pastor. So I want to look at what it's going to take to compensate the pastor from a salary, housing allowance, benefits standpoint, so that he can fully commit to the work of the ministry without going to bed at night worrying about being able to pay his utility bill or pay his student loans for the MDiv that he borrowed the money to do, or to fix the car that stopped running the other night, or repair his wife's minivan, whatever it is. I don't want that to be a stressor for him. So I think that's for me, that's sort of a starting point. Where do we need to be so as to not create an additional burden for this pastor? Here's a pet peeve of mine is, and I've seen this 2 or 3 times recently on position postings, where the church decides what they're going to pay the pastor based on the size of his family. Well, if he's got 5 kids, if he's married and has 5 kids, we're going to pay him more than if he's married and has 1 kid. To me, that is anathema. Like, that should never happen. If he is called for the responsibility and he's the skilled person that you need to do the job, it shouldn't matter the size of his family. You don't reward someone by paying them more. To me, that is the goofiest thing I've ever seen. You wouldn't see that. In fact, it's probably illegal. I don't know that for sure, but in the secular marketplace, that's probably an illegal thing to do. I don't know why churches think they can get away with that.
Yeah. I get it. And I think, in fairness to churches, hopefully they're looking at it from the opposite end. They're going, well, this guy does have 7 kids compared to 2, so we'll pay him more. That's what I'd like to believe. I don't know if that's true, but it doesn't make sense to me. I'm hiring a guy based upon his ability to move us from point A to point B. Yeah,
I agree with you on that. Now, again, I know that was a sensitive topic, and maybe we ruffled some feathers there. I hope that what churches will think through when they're putting a salary package together is that they're thinking generously. There's a lot to be said as we read through Scripture about the way that God has been generous to us. I've never seen a generous church suffer. I've never seen a generous person be unhappy. So I think if we take that posture as a church community, as a spiritual family, and say we're going to be generous to the pastor that we call, I think that the Lord will bless that. Now, there might be limited resources. There probably are limited resources. If you're listening to this podcast, which is Revitalize My Church, you're probably looking at your balance sheet and going, well, we don't have enough to pay him what we would like to be able to pay him. Find other ways to be generous so that if you are paying him less than what maybe he's worth, he doesn't feel that added pressure. I recorded a podcast back in the fall of 2024. I'll link to it in the show notes here, on co-vocational and bivocational ministry. My friend Eric Hoke wrote a book. He runs a company called I Help Pastors Get Jobs, where he literally helps pastors who want to be bivocational or co-vocational find a job outside of the church so that they are not a financial burden on the ministry that they're trying to lead. If you haven't listened to that episode, you can, like I said, check
Let
that
me
out in the
just
show
step
notes.
on that for just a moment. There's certainly an advantage of that. Here's the advantage. The guy that has a quote unquote real job besides being a pastor, he understands what his neighbors are really like versus the guy who hasn't had a secular job in a long, long time. And so that's an advantage. The downside of that is it takes time, right?
Yeah.
Pastor only has so much time. Do you want him to put 30 hours into your deal, or do you want him to put 50 hours into seeing the thing move forward?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I'm, as you know, I'm planting a church, and I am co-vocationally planting the church right now. So I have a full-time job, and then I guess we'd call it, for lack of a better way of putting it, a church planting hobby. And I'm trying to make it work. And it's tricky. Yeah. It's tricky getting up really early in the morning to write sermons. It's tricky and tiresome sometimes to have time in the evenings and the weekends to actually minister to the people that God has brought to be a part of our group. And so I understand the challenges of that. It's not impossible. And there are certain situations and circumstances that it's necessary, and there are certain situations and circumstances where it's actually desirable. And so Eric Hoke speaks a lot to that in that previous podcast episode.
Can I just pop one more thought in, and then we can move forward? I think that one of the issues you want to look for is drive. Does the guy have the drive to do it? Like if he has to work 20 hours over here and he can give you 30 hours, you might not be getting 30 quality hours unless he has the drive. Now, there's some pastors that they're pretty driven, and that can get in the way. That could be messy too. I get that. But drive and passion that doesn't come out in drive is pretty much a waste of time. I'm looking for a guy who is going, you know what? I'm going to own this thing, and I'm going to put my time into it. I'm going to do my share of the movement, and I'm going to try to galvanize people to move forward with me.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears, and we're going to hit one more topic before we wrap this up. One of the things that you have a fair bit of experience in is walking churches through that transitional period from a longtime pastor stepping out and a new pastor coming in. Can you walk us through what a healthy transition process would ideally look like when we're moving from that long-tenured pastor to that new leader?
Sure. One of the things to think about is the former lead pastor going to stay in the church or not? I would recommend highly that there's at least a transition period that he pulls out for 9 months, a year and a half, whatever. And I realize that if he's been there 30 years, his friends and family, et cetera, he might live across the street from the church for all I know. That's a hard thing to do. But to bring a new guy in with him seemingly looking over his shoulder all the time is a potential issue. The two statements that I encourage pastors that are retiring and staying or coming back to be able to say are these. One, I really love what Fred is doing. Fred's the new pastor. Really love what Fred is doing, and really love where Fred and the elders are taking the ministry. If he can't say that, my opinion, he can't stay. It's really that simple. It gets so messy. And the other side of that is that I'm a visionary. So I come in and I've always thought, hey, these people have been waiting 25 years to hear these amazing ideas that I have, and they are just ready to chomp at the bit week 2. That is a tremendous mistake that I've made. What I have to realize is they don't care about the vision that I'm going to bring. What they care about is, does he love me? Does he know me? Is he investing in me? If I do that, then down the road, I can share the vision. And they look at me like, well, we're not really sure about what he's saying, but we sort of like the guy and we trust him. We'll go that way. Because 20% of the people in the average church probably care about the vision. 20% of the people in the average church probably are never going to buy into your vision, which means there's 60% in the middle. They're the target. I'm going to love on them. I'm going to help them to eventually slowly see the process of where we're going to go. When you do that, you see God doing some cool things. So I talk a whole lot with new pastors coming into a situation and saying, hey, you got to do a lot of front porch conversation. You got to do a lot of kitchen conversation. Stop in for 10 minutes. Don't call and set something up, because then, Thelma thinks, oh, I got to clean the house. You just stop by. I was in the neighborhood, and you just talk and you get to know the kids' names. And before you know it, you're going, okay, this is going to work. I think the other thing the former lead pastor or the retiring lead pastor needs to do is, on his way out, he needs to celebrate the vision as to where we're going. And he needs to be involved, if he can, in the commissioning of the new guy. To hand off the baton is really, really important. And, the new pastor needs to do the same thing. He has to talk about some of the great things that the former pastor brought to the table and how he prepared us for today. He gave us this foundation, and we're building on the foundation that he gave to us. It's a mutual both way kind of a deal.
I have far less experience in this area than you do, but I have enough experience to have seen some things not work well and some things work well. And the speed is everything. And there's one thing that I think has to go fast, and that is the passing of the baton. So one of the things that we'll see from time to time is a pastor says, I'm going to retire. We're going to go and find my successor. And then we're going to hire him, and he's going to be my associate for 2 years. And then I'm going to ride off into the sunset. And 99 out of 100 times that guy doesn't make it through those 2 years before he says, this is not working. I'm out of here. And then that church finds themselves back at square one. When a pastor discovers or determines that he's ready to transition and the church is going to bring in the next leader, that handoff has to happen quicker than anything. I mean, it doesn't have to be instantaneous, but you need to have probably whatever amount of time you think it's going to take, shorten that by half or less. And now, on the flip side of that, the new guy coming in needs to expect his adaptation time to be twice as long as he thinks it's going to be. So you said just a minute ago, people want to hear your vision. They want to follow your lead. They want to charge the hill with you. Not yet. You need to spend far more time investing in relationships, putting marbles in those relational jars so that you can withdraw them later. I'm gonna boast on one of my friends, a pastor friend of ours named Tim Wilmetti, who took over a church in Ohio a number of years ago. And Tim and his wife, in the first season that they were there in the church, I think every Friday night or every other Friday night for month after month after month, they had everyone from the church over to their home for pizza. Yeah. And
it's a brilliant idea.
It was his idea. Maybe it was his wife's idea, Ashley. Maybe it was Ashley's idea. I don't know. Tim's a pretty bright guy, but maybe that was Ashley's idea. But the long-term benefit was they got everyone in their home. They got to invest personally with everyone in the church. These people had called him to be their pastor, but they needed to know before anything else that he was someone who would care for them and shepherd them and love on them. And we look, several years down the road, and Tim has done a really phenomenal job at transitioning his church and helping it find a new and fruitful future. And I'm going to say Tim is a very gifted guy. Yet I think it was the investment in those relationships early that helped him get the leverage that he needed to take the church where it needed to go.
For sure. And I think if you're listening to this, what you have to hear is that's not, let's have people over to my house so I can personally pitch vision to them. It's not that. Yeah. It's let's just love on them. Let's have them. If you're a pastor and you invite people to come to your home, like they look at that like, wow, that's really an honor to come. And now we come and you know what we talk about? Whatever. We don't have to do 10 years from now, we're going to be A, B, and C. Now, if you want to take 3 minutes and share something, that's okay. But anything longer than 3 minutes, then it feels like it's a bait and switch. And maybe it was. And if that's the case, then don't do that. But have people over to your home. It's gold. It is really gold.
Yeah. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, there's probably very little chance that you are the pastor that's about to start in a new job. Maybe you've just started in a new role, or maybe you're listening to this podcast and you're an elder or a board member or part of a screening and search team. If you don't have an outside coach coaching your new pastor when they come in, you need to take that little piece of advice that Ed just gave you, and you need to coach your new pastor on that. You need to tell them that for the first 6 to 12 months, they don't have permission to start implementing new vision and driving the church in a new direction, but that their first and their primary responsibility is to learn the stories of the people in the church, find out what it is that people love about the church and why they're there in the first place. One of the things that a lot of churches will make a mistake of is they believe we've called this new pastor to be our pastor because he thinks our church is amazing. And that's not always the case. Now, yes. I hope he sees potential in your church. I hope that he sees that between the vision that God has given him for a healthy, vibrant church and what you're starting with, he believes he can help you get there. But by and large, most pastors come into a church with an agenda to change the church shortly after they get there. And what we want to do is we want to temper those expectations on both parts and say, hey, let's just slow down the bus. Let's build relationships first. That's going to get us a lot further down the road.
Yeah. So one little side note that you'd be interested, I think, in hearing is if you're in a screening team, any pastor worth his weight is going to say, so what's it really like there? Just give me the real scoop. You're gonna feel like, man, if we tell him, what's behind door number 4, he's not coming. You need to tell him what's behind door number 4. Now, share the good things, but you got to, we got a couple of warts, and we're still working on those things. No surprises on either side. Like if I'm involved in the screening team process and we're interviewing someone, one of the first things I'm going to say is, hey, look, we're committed to be brutally honest with you. You can ask us anything you want, and we're asking you to be brutally honest with us. So if you're a pastor looking for a position, don't sell yourself for anything that you're not. Don't do that, because it will not work. 2 years from now, you'll be looking for a new ministry. And if you are the screening team or the search team, don't sell that your church is this amazing church that is just pretty much, if Jesus were on the earth, he'd be going to our church. Don't do that. Just be really honest.
Yeah. I can speak to what's behind door number 4, just in case you want to know. It's the overhead projector, and it's a whole bunch of plastic flowers waiting to be put out for the next season.
Because they never wilt. I mean, they have dust on them, but they never wilt. There
is a closet in your church building that is full of plastic flowers. I know, because I've been there. I've been to all of the churches that have that. Okay, Ed, this has been a great conversation for me. It's been a little long. Hopefully our guests have stuck it out to the end. If somebody's listening to this podcast and, hey, they are looking for maybe a little additional counsel, advice, some coaching, can somebody reach out to you and just maybe connect with you on a Zoom or a phone call at some point?
Absolutely. Developing Next Level Leaders .org. So just get a hold of me. I'd love to chat with you. You could edit assistcx.org. You could email me there. I'd love to help you in any way that I possibly can. All the ideas are for free, so we could just talk.
All right. We will link to your contact information in the show notes of this episode.
Sounds
Ed, I always enjoy hanging out with you. For those of you who did make it all the way to the end of this episode, we thank you for doing so. And just want to remind you that if you haven't yet subscribed wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, make sure that you do that so you don't miss future episodes. We release a new episode on the 1st and the 15th of every month, and we want to make sure that you don't miss any of this great content. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Revitalize My Church podcast.